Jackson Reed stood at the altar, his jaw clenched so tight he could hear his own teeth grinding. In less than 10 minutes, he was supposed to marry a woman he'd only met 3 times. A woman the whole town whispered about, calling her the old maid. A woman who had no more choice in this than a calf at branding time. The banker's voice was a cold, sharp echo in his head. Marry within the month, or lose the ranch. It felt like a death sentence either way. He could feel the eyes of the entire town on his back, their whispers slithering like snakes through the pews. They thought they were saving him. Saving his little girl. Saving his land. They had no idea they'd just lit the fuse on a powder keg. Just 2 weeks ago, he'd been in Morrison's office, a man brought to his knees. The drought had stolen half his herd, and the debt was a noose tightening around his neck with every passing day. Morrison had leaned back in his big leather chair, a smug, snake-like smile playing on his lips. "I have a solution for you, Reed," he'd said, his voice smooth as poison. "The town committee feels you need a wife. It's not proper. A man like you raising a little girl alone. We found the perfect candidate for you." Jackson had laughed then, a raw, bitter sound that held no humor. "I buried my wife 6 months ago, Morrison. I'm not in the market." But Morrison's smile never faltered. It only widened. "Then you'll be burying your ranch too. Marry Lillian Hartwell by the end of the month, or I call in every last cent you owe." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, and they both knew it. The very next day, the town's chief busybody, Mrs. Henderson, had shown up at his door, dragging the solution along with her. Lillian Hartwell, 28 years old, which in this part of the country made her a fossil on the verge of turning to dust. She was the school teacher, fresh from Boston 3 years back, arriving under a dark cloud of mystery no one had ever quite figured out. The children were scared of her, and the men were intimidated by a mind they knew was sharper than any blade they owned. She was tall, severe, and wrong for him in every single way a person could be wrong. What Jackson didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Lillian was trapped in a cage of her own making. Back in Boston, she'd been engaged to a society prince, a man with a golden name and a silver tongue, only to find out he already had a wife. The scandal hadn't just broken her heart, it had shattered her entire life. Her father, a respected doctor, had died from the shame of it all. So she'd fled west to disappear, to teach children on the frontier and forget the whispers of damaged goods. But the whispers had a way of following you no matter how far you ran. And now she had her own ultimatum. The school board chairman, a man named Williams who was thick as a post and twice as dense, had cornered her just yesterday after class. "Miss Hartwell, the board feels it's improper," he'd stammered, unable to meet her gaze. "A woman of your age, all alone. People are talking." Lillian had stood tall, her Boston spine like a rod of iron. "My personal life is none of the board's concern." Williams had just shaken his head, a pitying look on his face. "In this town it is. Marry Jackson Reed and keep your job, or be on the next stagecoach out of town." So here they were, 2 prisoners walking toward a life sentence, with the whole town as their wardens. The church doors creaked open, and a heavy silence fell. Lillian walked down the aisle in a plain gray dress that looked more like a uniform than a wedding gown. Her face was a mask of cold dignity, but Jackson could see the pure terror hiding in her eyes. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked only at the angry man waiting for her at the altar. And in that moment, he saw a mirror of his own despair. The ceremony was a blur of suffocating tension. The Reverend spoke the words so fast, they ran together into a meaningless drone. Jackson's 2-year-old daughter, Emma, cried the entire time from the front pew, a tiny mourner at her own father's funeral. When the Reverend finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Jackson barely brushed his lips against her cold cheek. Lillian's face burned with a shame so hot it felt like a brand, searing her to the bone. The reception was even worse. It wasn't a celebration. It was a victory lap for the town committee. The townspeople slapped Jackson on the back, congratulating themselves on their brilliant, benevolent plan. "Everyone wins!" Mrs. Henderson declared, her voice booming through the room. Jackson gripped his coffee cup, his knuckles turning white. He'd just traded his freedom for a ranch that was probably doomed to fail anyway. He felt like a fool. The ride home was dead silent, a thick, suffocating quiet broken only by the sound of Emma whimpering in Lillian's stiff, unfamiliar arms. When they reached the farmhouse, Lillian stepped out of the wagon and just stared at the place. It was clean. He kept it clean for Sarah's memory, but it was empty of joy. It was a house that had given up. Jackson dropped their bags on the floor with a thud that echoed through the empty rooms. "Let's get one thing straight," he said, his voice like ice. "This is a business deal. You have your room. You take care of Emma and the house. That's it. We don't pretend this is anything else." Lillian lifted her chin, that Boston pride a shield around her heart. "Fine by me, Mr. Reed, but I have my own terms. I require books and writing materials, and I will not be treated like a hired girl. I will raise your daughter my way." They glared at each other across the dimly lit room, two strangers bound by a contract they both despised. Emma started crying again, her little arms reaching for her father. Jackson scooped her up, a wave of familiar relief washing over him as he held her close. Lillian watched them, a sharp pain cracking through her composure. Even a child could see she didn't belong here. "I didn't ask for this," Jackson said, his voice low and ragged. Lillian picked up her single bag. "Neither did I, Mr. Reed, but here we are." She walked up the stairs to her new prison, leaving him alone in the quiet darkness. They were two broken people, pushed together by a town that meant well. But good intentions can pave a road straight to hell. And neither of them knew that the foundation of their new home was built on a lie far more dangerous than an unwanted marriage. The first week was a silent, bitter war. They moved around each other like ghosts, two resentful shadows trapped in a house that felt smaller with every passing day. Lillian, with the cold efficiency of a military general, began reorganizing everything. She cleaned, she sorted, she imposed a rigid Boston logic on his rustic, comfortable chaos. She was trying to erase the ghost of the woman who came before her. Jackson, in a petty act of rebellion, would move things back as soon as she was done. He was clinging to the memory of his late wife, Sarah, trying to preserve a past that was already gone. Little Emma was caught in the crossfire. The tension in the house was a poison in the air, making her anxious and prone to wild tantrums. She refused to let Lillian feed her, threw toys whenever Lillian tried to play, and clung to Jackson like he was the last solid thing in her shifting, terrifying world. Lillian approached childcare like an academic subject. She read to the toddler from dry educational books about geology and botany. She tried to enforce a strict schedule for naps and meals. It was an absolute disaster. "She doesn't like me," Lillian stated one evening, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. Jackson had just taken a screaming Emma from her arms, the child's tears soaking his shirt. "She's just adjusting," he mumbled, but they both knew it was a lie. Emma was a living, breathing reminder of everything they had both lost: his happy marriage, her dream of a family. They were a constant source of pain to each other. One night, everything changed. A storm blew in from the north, a blizzard that howled like a demon and shook the little farmhouse to its very foundations. Jackson had just come in from securing the barn when he heard Lillian scream his name. The sound cut through the roar of the wind, sharp with an urgency that froze his blood solid in his veins. He burst through the door and found them in Emma's room. His daughter's face was flushed a terrifying shade of red, her tiny body burning with a fever he could feel from across the room. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged gasp, a terrible sound that ripped his heart in two. "How long has she been like this?" Lillian demanded, her usual icy composure replaced by a fierce, terrifying focus. She was fine at dinner, Jackson stammered, his own hands shaking as he touched Emma's forehead. It was like touching a hot stove. His mind flashed back to Sarah's death, how a simple sickness had turned deadly in a matter of hours, how helpless he had been then, how helpless he was now. "We have to get her to the doctor," he said, grabbing for his coat in a blind panic. But Lillian's hand shot out and gripped his arm, her fingers like steel. "Look outside, Jackson. We would never make it. The cold would kill her before we got a mile down the road." He looked. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was a solid white wall, a churning vortex of ice and wind. They were trapped. Just like they'd been trapped in this marriage. But this time, it was his daughter's life on the line. "Then what do we do?" he whispered, the desperation clawing at his throat, choking him. Lillian was already moving. "My father was a doctor," she said, her voice steady and calm as she laid Emma gently on the bed. "I was his assistant for 10 years. I know what to do, but I need your help. Now." For the rest of that long, terrifying night, the walls between them didn't just crumble, they were blown to smithereens. Lillian took command with an authority that stunned him. She sent him for cool water, for clean cloths, for alcohol from the pantry. She mixed a remedy from a small, leather-bound medical kit she'd brought from Boston, a secret part of her past he never knew she had. "Keep talking to her," she ordered as she worked, her hands swift and sure. "Let her hear your voice. They fight harder when they know you're there." So Jackson talked. He told Emma about the horses, about the coming spring, about how much her daddy loved her more than the whole world. And through his own stream of desperate, pleading words, he heard Lillian's voice join his. She sang soft lullabies in a language he didn't recognize, some beautiful, ancient tongue. She told stories of brave princesses fighting off fevers as if they were fire-breathing dragons. She whispered prayers with a raw sincerity that shook him to his core. For the first time, he saw past the stern, cold schoolteacher. He saw a woman fighting for his child's life with every ounce of her being. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the frosted window, Emma's fever broke. Her breathing evened out, and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Jackson slumped in his chair, utterly spent, his body aching with exhaustion and relief. Lillian sat by the bed, her hand resting gently on Emma's small chest, feeling the steady rise and fall. "She's going to be fine," she said softly. And in her voice, Jackson heard not duty, but love. A fierce, protective love for his daughter. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate for the miracle she had performed. She looked up, a flicker of surprise in her tired eyes. Then she gave him a small, genuine smile. It was the first one he'd ever seen. It transformed her entire face, and he realized with a sudden jolt that she was beautiful. "My father used to say that healing is about caring enough to fight for someone," she said, "even when the odds are impossible." Later that morning, with Emma playing quietly on a blanket on the floor, they shared a pot of coffee. For the first time, they actually talked. She told him about the scandal in Boston, about the man who broke her and the father she lost. He told her about Sarah, about how much he'd loved her, about how he never thought he could feel anything again. Then, surprising himself, he told her the truth about the ranch. "It's failing," he confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Even without Morrison's threats, I don't know how I can hold on to it." Lillian set her cup down and looked him straight in the eye, her gaze clear and unwavering. "I'm good with numbers, Jackson. Better than most men. Let me see your books." His first instinct was a surge of prideful refusal. This was his failure, his burden to bear. But then he remembered her in the sick room, calm and competent while he was falling apart. He nodded. He led her to his small, cluttered desk and opened the ledgers, revealing years of struggle written in black ink. 3 hours later she looked up from the pages, but her face wasn't filled with pity. It was a mask of cold, calculating fury. "These numbers are a lie," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Jackson, I think someone has been systematically stealing from you for years." The accusation hung in the air between them, more shocking than the blizzard. A forced marriage was one thing. This was something else entirely. This was a conspiracy. And as he looked at his unwanted wife, he realized with a profound shock that he wasn't facing it alone anymore. Lillian dove into the ranch's financial records like a hawk circling its prey. For 3 days straight, she barely ate or slept. The kitchen table was buried under a mountain of ledgers, receipts, and loan documents. What she uncovered was a web of deceit so intricate and cunning, Jackson never would have seen it on his own. It was more than just a few shady loans or padded bills. Banker Morrison had been bleeding him dry for years, slowly and methodically. He'd fabricated charges for cattle feed that was never delivered. He'd inflated interest rates to illegal levels, hiding the calculations in complex legal jargon. He'd invented service fees and territorial taxes out of thin air. The drought was real, yes, but it was Morrison's theft that had pushed Jackson to the breaking point. It had all been a setup, from the very beginning. "Look here," Lillian said, her finger tracing a column of figures that made no sense. Jackson leaned over her shoulder, the scent of her hair, clean and floral, a strange comfort in the middle of his rising rage. For a moment they weren't strangers forced together by circumstance. They were partners, a team. "He created the crisis," Lillian explained, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "He pushed you to the absolute edge of ruin, so the town committee would have a plausible excuse to step in. He wanted you weak. He wanted you desperate. He wanted you to have no other choice." Jackson straightened up, a cold dread washing over him, colder than any winter storm. "But why? Why go to all that trouble? He was already getting my money." Lillian's eyes were sharp, analytical, piecing together a puzzle he didn't even know existed. "That's the part that doesn't make sense," she mused. "It's too elaborate for just skimming a few $100s here and there. There has to be a bigger play. He didn't just want your money, Jackson. He wants your land." The realization hit Jackson like a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs. The marriage wasn't a solution offered by the town. It was a weapon, crafted by Morrison himself. They forced him to marry an outsider, a woman from back east with no family or allies in town, assuming she'd be too intimidated or too ignorant to question anything. They assumed she would be a quiet, compliant witness to his final ruin. They had assumed wrong. "We need proof," Lillian said, her voice firm, pulling him back from the brink. "Proof that will stand up in court. I can lay out the financial case, but to take down a man like Morrison, a man who owns this town, we need more. We need to find out who else is involved." Jackson shook his head, the old despair creeping back in. "Morrison is the most powerful man in the territory. No one will dare speak a word against him." But Lillian gave him a smile that was all sharp edges and cold steel. "People believe evidence, Jackson, and fear dies when people realize they aren't alone. I'll wager you aren't his only victim." They decided to start with the other ranchers, the ones who had loans with Morrison's bank. It was a risky, desperate move. Snitching on the town banker could get a man blacklisted, his credit cut off, or worse. Their first visit was to an old rancher named Silas Croft, a man whose land bordered Jackson's. Silas was weathered and wary, his eyes full of a deep-seated suspicion that life had taught him well. Jackson tried to explain their situation, but Silas just shook his head, his face a grim mask. "Best leave it alone, son. Morrison owns this town, lock, stock, and barrel." But then Lillian spoke. She didn't threaten or plead or appeal to his emotions. She laid out the facts, calmly and logically. She showed Silas a forged receipt from Jackson's ledger that was nearly identical to one of his own. She showed him how the interest was being calculated, a clear violation of territorial law. She spoke not as an accuser, but as an ally. She was offering him a way out of the same trap he'd been caught in for years. Silas stared at the papers, his tough, leathery facade cracking right before their eyes. "He did the same thing to me," he whispered, his voice thick with a shame he'd carried in silence for years. "Told me I was a bad businessman. Drove my own son away, thinking his old man was a failure. That was the first crack in the dam." After Silas Croft agreed to talk, 2 more ranchers came forward, then another. Men who had been slowly strangled by Morrison's predatory loans, all of them convinced they were alone in their failure, too proud and too ashamed to speak up. Lillian compiled their stories, building a fortress of evidence, piece by damning piece. The confrontation was set for Friday morning at the bank. Jackson and Lillian walked in together, shoulder to shoulder. They weren't a broken rancher and his mail-order bride anymore. They were a unified force. Morrison greeted them with his usual oily charm, completely oblivious. "Well, well, the happy couple. How's married life treating you, Reed?" "We're here about the fraud," Lillian said, her voice cutting through the pleasantries like a shard of glass. She spread the documents across his polished desk. The ledgers, the forged receipts, the sworn signed statements from Silas Croft and the others. Morrison's face went from pale to purple in a matter of seconds. He blustered, he threatened, he called her a meddling city woman who didn't understand how things worked out here on the frontier. But Lillian didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. "I understand theft, Mr. Morrison, and I understand conspiracy." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone that made the hairs on Jackson's arms stand up. "And I know you didn't do this alone. The same town committee that forced my husband to marry me. They've been helping you, haven't they? Covering your tracks? Who are they, Mr. Morrison? Is it Williams, the school board chairman who threatened my job? Is it Mrs. Henderson, who so kindly chaperoned me to my new prison?" Morrison's eyes widened in pure panic. She had him. She had them all. The crowd that had gathered outside the bank, drawn by the commotion, pressed their faces against the windows, watching the town's petty tyrant crumble. His power was built on the perception of invincibility, and in that single moment, it shattered into a million pieces. "Fine," he croaked, his voice a dry, defeated rasp. "I'll fix the accounts." "You'll do more than that," Jackson said, his own voice hard as granite, finding its strength after years of silence. "You will provide full restitution to everyone you've cheated, and you will give us the names of your partners." They walked out of that bank into the bright sunlight, leaving the ruins of a petty empire behind them. That night, for the first time, the house didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a home. Jackson opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving since before Sarah died. "To you," he toasted, looking at Lillian across the table. "You should have been a lawyer," she laughed, a sound that was starting to become wonderfully familiar. "They don't let women be lawyers, but they do let them be wives." Their eyes met, and something electric, something powerful, passed between them. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was respect, admiration, and something else, something deeper and more dangerous that neither of them was ready to name. The war for the ranch was won, but they had just made enemies of the most powerful people in town, and the real battle was just beginning. In the weeks that followed their stunning victory over Morrison, a fragile truce settled over the farmhouse. The bitter tension was gone, replaced by a tentative, hesitant curiosity. They started talking, really talking, in the long, quiet evenings after Emma was asleep. He told her about his dreams for the ranch, dreams he thought had died with Sarah. She told him about Boston, about the world of books and art and intellectual debate she'd been forced to leave behind. They were 2 incredibly different people, from 2 different worlds, yet they found a surprising amount of common ground in their shared stubbornness and their sharp, analytical minds. The physical space between them began to shrink too. They'd brush shoulders in the cramped kitchen. Their hands would touch as they passed a cup of coffee. Each accidental contact was a small spark in the quiet house, a jolt of awareness that left them both slightly breathless. Jackson found himself watching her constantly. He noticed the way a stray piece of dark hair would fall across her forehead when she was concentrating on the account books, or the unexpected, dazzling warmth in her smile when Emma made her laugh. He was starting to see the woman, not the arrangement. Emma was the bridge between their two separate islands. The little girl, no longer caught in a web of anxiety and resentment, began to blossom under Lillian's patient care. One afternoon, she ran to Lillian with a scraped knee, tears streaming down her face, crying, "Mama Lily!" without a second thought. Lillian froze, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else, something deeply vulnerable. Then she gently cleaned the cut and kissed it better, holding the little girl close. Jackson watched from the doorway, his heart twisting in his chest. A part of him, the part that still belonged to Sarah, felt a sharp pang of guilt, a sense of betrayal. But a larger part, the part that was learning to live again, felt an overwhelming sense of rightness. This was a family. It wasn't the one he'd planned, but it was real. And it was his. Their fragile peace, however, was about to be shattered. A letter arrived, bearing a Boston postmark. It was addressed to Lillian. She read it with a face devoid of all emotion, a perfect, chilling mask. Then, without a word, she passed it to Jackson. It was from a lawyer. Her former fiancé, the man who had publicly ruined her and indirectly caused her father's death, was now a widower. His wife had died, and he was formally, and very publicly, apologizing for his youthful indiscretion. He was offering her a chance to return to Boston, to restore her name, to take her rightful place in society. He was offering her the life she was supposed to have. The letter was a bomb dropped into the middle of their quiet, carefully constructed life. It represented everything Lillian had lost, and everything she could now, impossibly, regain. A world of comfort, of respectability, of intellectual peers. A world 1,000,000 miles away from dust, drought, and a marriage of convenience to a rough-hewn rancher and his small daughter. "What are you going to do?" Jackson asked, his voice carefully neutral, though his stomach was churning with a feeling he refused to name. It felt a lot like fear. "I don't know," she said quietly, folding the letter with precise, steady hands. "He destroyed my family. My father. My father died because of the shame he brought upon us. But Jackson saw it. A flicker of something in her eyes. A longing for the world she'd been so violently ripped away from. The unspoken question hung between them for days, a heavy, suffocating weight. Was this life, their life, enough? Was he enough? The town dance was their first public outing since the incident at the bank. The remaining members of the town committee, their power diminished but their resentment simmering, watched them with cold, hateful eyes. But most of the town now saw them as heroes. They were no longer the mismatched, pitied couple. They were the Reeds, the couple who had stood up to the corruption that had plagued the town for years. Lillian wore a borrowed blue dress, and with her hair softened around her face, she looked breathtaking. Jackson couldn't take his eyes off her all night. When he asked her to dance, her hand in his felt like it belonged there, like it had always been meant to be there. "We're good at this," she murmured, her face close to his as they moved together. "At what?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Pretending?" she said, but the smile in her eyes told a different story. They weren't pretending anymore. And he knew, in that moment, that he was falling in love with his wife. The spell was broken when a man stumbled through the doors of the town hall, his face pale with panic, his eyes wide with alarm. "It's the Weatherbys!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "They're here! Sarah's parents!" Jackson's blood ran cold. The Weatherbees. They had despised him from the moment he married their daughter, believing a poor, uneducated rancher was beneath their wealthy Boston family. They hadn't even come to Sarah's funeral. Why were they here now, after all this time? He and Lillian rushed home, a sense of shared dread hanging over them like a shroud. They found them waiting on their porch, two severe figures dressed in funereal black, their faces set like stone. Mr. and Mrs. Weatherby. And standing beside them, a slick-looking lawyer holding a sheaf of papers. "We're here for our granddaughter," Mrs. Weatherby announced, her voice dripping with disdain as her cold eyes swept from Jackson to Lillian. "A child should be with her proper family, not in this hovel with a stranger." The lawyer stepped forward and handed Jackson the papers. It was a custody petition. They were suing for Emma. Their claim? That Jackson was an unfit father, proven by his financial instability and his hasty sham marriage to an adventuress of questionable character. They were going to take his daughter, and they were going to use the very arrangement that had saved his ranch to destroy his family forever. The custody hearing was a living nightmare. The Weatherby's lawyer, a slick talker from Boston with a silver tongue and a heart of stone, painted a picture of Jackson as a desperate, failing rancher who had entered into a loveless marriage purely for financial gain. He twisted the story of their fight against Morrison, portraying them not as heroes, but as reckless vigilantes who had made powerful enemies and put their own child in danger. He brought up Lillian's past, the scandal with her married fiancé, painting her as a woman of loose morals, an unsuitable and dangerous guardian for a young girl. The town, which had so recently celebrated them, was now divided. The remnants of Morrison's cronies on the town council, eager for revenge, sided with the Weatherbys, providing testimony that painted Jackson and Lillian in the worst possible light. It was a coordinated attack, a vicious act of revenge orchestrated by forces they couldn't see. Jackson and Lillian felt the ground crumbling beneath them. How could they prove their marriage was real? How could they prove their family was built on love when its very foundation was a business deal? They were losing. Jackson could feel it in his bones. The judge, an old traditionalist, was clearly swayed by the Weatherbys' wealth and social standing. He looked at Lillian with open suspicion, and at Jackson with a kind of weary pity. Despair was beginning to set in, a cold, heavy blanket smothering the hope they had so recently found. On the last day of the hearing, Lillian was called to the stand. She looked small and vulnerable in the witness box, but when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, ringing through the silent courtroom. She didn't talk about law or finances or contracts. She talked about Emma. "I did not give birth to Emma Reed," she began, her eyes locked on the judge's face. "But I have held her through fevers in the dead of night. I have taught her the names of the wildflowers that grow in our meadow. I have rocked her back to sleep after nightmares, and I have kissed her scraped knees. Love, Your Honor, is not about biology. It's about showing up. It's about choosing to be a mother, every single day." Her voice cracked with an emotion so raw and powerful it brought tears to Jackson's eyes. "The Weatherbys can offer her wealth and privilege. I can only offer her a home. I can only offer her my whole heart." It was beautiful. It was powerful. But Jackson feared it wouldn't be enough. The lawyer for the Weatherbys stood up, a smug, predatory look on his face, ready for the kill. "Mrs. Reed," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "You claim to love this child. Yet isn't it true that you recently received a proposal to return to Boston, to a life of comfort and wealth with your former associate?" A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Jackson's heart stopped beating. Lillian went pale as a sheet. The lawyer had found out about the letter. He had found their one great vulnerability. "Did you, or did you not, consider abandoning this so-called family for a better offer?" the lawyer pressed, his voice like a whip. Lillian looked cornered, trapped. The whole case, Emma's entire future, balanced on the razor's edge of her answer. She took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity that stunned everyone into silence. "I did receive such an offer." The lawyer smiled, sensing a swift and total victory. "And what was your reply, Mrs. Reed?" Lillian looked past the lawyer, past the sneering faces of the Weatherbys, past the grim face of the judge. Her eyes found Jackson's in the stunned courtroom, and she gave him a look of such profound love and commitment that it took his breath away. "My reply," she said, her voice soaring with a strength that filled the entire room, "was that my rightful place was no longer in Boston. My rightful place is on a dusty ranch in Wyoming. My rightful place is with my husband, and my rightful place is with my daughter, Emma." But the lawyer wasn't done. He pulled out one last devastating weapon. "Your Honor," he said, turning to the judge with a theatrical flourish, "we have one final piece of evidence. A letter, written by the late Sarah Reed Weatherby, shortly before her death." He handed a document to the court clerk. In it, she details her husband's financial incompetence and expresses her grave concerns for her daughter's future should she remain in his care. She explicitly states that in the event of her death, she wishes for sole custody of her daughter to be granted to her parents. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. Sarah would never ever do that to him. But as the clerk read the letter aloud, in a clear, emotionless voice, Jackson recognized his late wife's elegant handwriting. The words were a knife in his heart, twisting and turning. A betrayal from beyond the grave. The letter sealed it. He could see it in the judge's eyes. The Weatherbys had won. They were going to lose Emma. That night, the farmhouse was as silent as a tomb. They had lost. The judge would make his official ruling in the morning, but it was just a formality. Emma was asleep upstairs, blissfully oblivious to the fact that her entire world was about to be torn apart. Jackson sat at the kitchen table, staring at a copy of Sarah's letter, his world completely shattered. He had not only lost his daughter, but the memory of his first wife, the woman he had loved so dearly, was now tainted by this inexplicable, cruel betrayal. "It doesn't make sense," Lillian said, her voice a ragged whisper. She had been staring at the letter for over an hour, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. "The handwriting is hers, I can see that. But the language. Financial incompetence, fiduciary responsibility. It doesn't sound like a rancher's wife, Jackson. It sounds like a banker. It sounds like Morrison." A tiny spark flickered in the suffocating darkness. Lillian stood up and began pacing the small kitchen, her mind working furiously, connecting dots that Jackson couldn't even see. The custody battle, the Weatherbys showing up out of nowhere just weeks after we defeated him. It's all connected. This is Morrison's revenge. He couldn't ruin you financially, so he decided to ruin you personally. He conspired with the Weatherbys. He must have. "But the letter, Lillian," Jackson said, his voice hoarse with grief. "It's her handwriting. I know her handwriting." "Is it?" Lillian said, her eyes suddenly gleaming with a fierce, brilliant intensity. "Or is it a perfect, masterful forgery?" Morrison knew Sarah. He had access to her signature on dozens of bank documents. Jackson think. When did Sarah supposedly write this letter? "The lawyer said it was dated a week before she died," Jackson replied, his mind numb. Lillian's eyes widened. "A week before she died," she repeated slowly, tasting the words. "Jackson, where did you keep your important papers back then? Your deeds, your loan agreements?" "In the strong box at the bank," he said, the answer automatic. "At Morrison's bank." Lillian slammed her hand on the table, a sharp crack that broke the silence. "That's it. It has to be. Sarah didn't write that letter. Morrison did. He forged it. He's been planning this for years. This was his endgame all along. If he couldn't steal the ranch, He would steal your child and hand the ranch's only heir over to his wealthy allies, the Weatherbys. It was a wild theory, a desperate last-minute gamble, but it was the only thing they had. "How do we prove it?" Jackson asked, a tiny sliver of hope piercing through his despair. "We need a confession," Lillian said, her face set with a grim, determined resolve. "And I know just how to get it." The next morning, just 1 hour before the final ruling was to be handed down, Lillian walked into Morrison's bank. She went alone. She had told Jackson to wait for her at the courthouse. This was something she had to do herself. Morrison was sitting at his desk, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He looked like a cat that had just swallowed a canary. "Come to beg, Mrs. Reed," he sneered, not even bothering to stand. "A little late for that, don't you think?" "I'm not here to beg," Lillian said, her voice as cold and even as a frozen lake. "I'm here to offer you a deal." She placed the letter from her Boston fiancé on his desk, the one offering her a new life of wealth and privilege. "The Weatherbys are going to win," she said, her tone matter of fact. "Jackson will be broken. He'll sell the ranch for pennies on the dollar. You'll finally get what you always wanted. But I'm leaving. I'm going back to Boston. And I want my share." Morrison stared at her, stunned into silence for a moment. "Your share of what?" he finally managed to ask. "My share of the silence," Lillian said, leaning closer across the desk, her eyes hard as diamonds. "I know you forged that letter, Morrison. I know you and the Weatherbys planned this whole disgusting affair from the start. I'm not going to expose you. Why would I? I'm done with this place. I just want enough money to start over. A small price to pay to ensure your dirty little secret stays buried forever." It was the perfect bait. She was playing to his greed and his arrogance, mirroring his own cynical view of the world. He believed she was just like him, selfish and opportunistic to the core. He laughed, a low, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet bank. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, schoolteacher. That letter was a masterpiece, wasn't it? Took me weeks to perfect Sarah's little flourishes. The Weatherbys paid handsomely for it." He leaned back in his chair, gloating, savoring his victory. "They get the girl. I get a piece of the ranch when they force the sale. Everyone wins." "Not everyone," a deep voice said from the doorway. Morrison spun around in his chair. Jackson was standing there, and beside him, Sheriff Miller, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. They had been in the back room. They had heard every single word. The look on Morrison's face, the sudden, complete, and devastating understanding that he had been played, was a sight Jackson would cherish for the rest of his life. They raced to the courthouse, Sheriff Miller dragging a sputtering, defeated Morrison behind them. They burst into the courtroom just as the judge was adjusting his spectacles, about to deliver his final verdict. "Your Honor, we have new evidence!" Jackson shouted, his voice ringing with triumph. What followed was swift and decisive. Morrison, facing a long prison sentence for fraud, conspiracy, and forgery, confessed to everything. He detailed the entire plot with the Weatherbys, how they had contacted him after he was defeated, how they had planned to seize Emma and, through her, gain control of the ranch and its water rights. The Weatherbys were arrested on the spot, their faces a mixture of shock and impotent rage. The judge, his face a grim mask of fury, tore up his original ruling. He declared the custody case null and void, dismissed with extreme prejudice. He awarded sole and permanent custody of Emma to Jackson and Lillian Reed. He then looked at Lillian, a profound, newfound respect in his old eyes. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice humbled, "this court, and this entire town, owes you an apology. Emma was theirs. She was safe." As they walked out of the courthouse, Lillian, Jackson, and a confused but happy Emma held tight between them. They were met with a crowd of cheering townspeople. They hadn't just saved their daughter. They had saved the entire town from the cancer of corruption that had been poisoning it for years. That night, for the first time, Jackson led Lillian not to her separate room, but to his. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Lillian whispered as he closed the door behind them, her voice trembling slightly. "None of it." "No," Jackson said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer deny. He gently touched her cheek, his rough fingers tracing the line of her jaw. But it did. He had been forced to marry her to save his ranch, but in the end, she had saved him. She had saved his daughter. She had saved his soul. He had fallen in love with his wife. And as he leaned down to kiss her, not with the hesitant gratitude of before, but with all the passion and love in his heart, he knew their real story was just beginning. 1 year later, Jackson stood on his porch and watched Lillian teach a now 4-year-old Emma how to weave wildflowers into a crown. The ranch was thriving. The cattle were fat, the fields were green, and for the first time since he'd inherited the land, they were truly, deeply profitable. But the real transformation was in the home. It was filled with laughter and books and the smell of Lillian's baking. Lillian was pregnant, her belly round and full with their first child together. She had abandoned the severe gray dresses for soft blues and greens, and her face, once a mask of stern defensiveness, was now open and radiant with a happiness that took his breath away. The town had changed too. With Morrison and his cronies gone, a new sense of fairness and opportunity had taken root. And at the center of it all was Lillian. She had started a small schoolhouse on their property, teaching not just Emma, but a dozen other children from the surrounding ranches. The old maid from Boston had become the respected, beloved heart of their community. Emma ran up to the porch, her face beaming, holding up the lopsided flower crown. "It's for the new baby, Mama Lily," she said, her voice bright and confident. Lillian's face lit up with a love so pure and powerful, it almost brought Jackson to his knees. He thought back to that desperate, angry man at the altar, so full of bitterness and resentment. He had been so sure his life was over. He had been so wrong. His life was just beginning. That night, as they sat together on the porch swing, Emma asleep in Lillian's lap, Lillian looked up at the vast blanket of stars. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked softly. "Our wedding." Jackson smiled, pulling her closer, his arm wrapping around her, and the gentle swell of their future. "I think about how the whole town thought they were forcing two broken people together to solve a problem. They thought they were saving a ranch." He looked at his happy daughter, at his beautiful, pregnant wife, at the peaceful land stretching out before them under the moonlight. "They had no idea," he whispered, his voice full of wonder, "that they were creating a miracle. They had been forged in the fire of hardship and betrayal, their love story written not in poetry, but in court documents and account ledgers. It wasn't the love story either of them had ever dreamed of. It was better. It was real. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of unexpected love and frontier justice.